IFP President Velenkosini Hlabisa says it is unfair that the late Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi is solely being blamed for the violence during the late 80s and early 90s. Buthelezi died Saturday morning at his home at the age of 95. His passing has been met with mixed reactions, with many criticising his contentious legacy. This is in response to an article from Mondli Makhanya about the life of Buthelezi. So at this point, we're joined by IFP spokesperson Mkhuleko Hlengwa. It's so good to have you here on Morning Live, just talking to us. Thanks again, and I suppose we need to also convey condolences to you and your colleagues and those in the IFP. How did you all sort of take the news, and perhaps you can give us a bit of an understanding of what it was like receiving this for a leader that certainly you all revered?
Thank you very much, Leanne. Maybe at the outset, let me convey the appreciation of the Buthelezi family and the Mzila family for the outpouring of love and support during this difficult time. And the family truly appreciates knowing that millions of South Africans stand with them, and people around the world in mourning and celebrating Prince Buthelezi. Obviously, it's a very difficult time because you will recall that Prince Buthelezi was in hospital. And we then got the news that he had been discharged and would be recuperating at home. So that gave us a renewed sense of hope that he was on the road to recovery. And these are the news that we least expected. So it is a very heavy blow for us, and it's a pain that even time will not heal.
Yeah, certainly, no matter what age. And I mean, the influence that the late Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi had on South Africa through every generation has been massive. And I know that, you know, they're very big differing views, and many people have their own opinions on this. But let's get your view on this, because I know that reading some of the articles and hearing some of the interviews, you obviously feel offense towards a lot of this. So perhaps maybe we can get your view on the Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the leader of the IFP for all those years, and somebody who had an indelible effect on South Africa and the world.
Leanne, maybe one must put the qualification at the outset that none of us are going to call the Prince a saint. We considered him, as he did, a human being in the course of service. Having said that, you will recall that legacies are always contested. Madiba at some point has been called a sellout, and 2023 years later, not everybody agrees with Christ. But every disagreement must actually be in context. Now, the Mondli Makhanya article, which was referred to in the segment you had with Professor Vilakazi, we were not surprised. Mondli Makhanya, at some point masquerading as Oscar Gumede, wrote an article where he was laying out his own participation and presence in the atrocities of the killings of IFP people. It's precisely why we went on a march as the IFP to the offices of the City Press last year to say that Mondli Makhanya is abusing media freedom as an editor of a major newspaper by having biased opinion pieces which he writes masquerading as fact without acknowledging, you know, his own contribution and own role. Never once has he presented facts to back up the allegations he makes against Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And on that score, Mr. Makhanya and Prince Buthelezi were currently in court as we speak right now on that very matter. And it is a court action we are going to continue with, even with the prince having passed on. The second point is that in what Prof. Vilakazi was saying earlier, because words are important, she says there was violence, which she then places at the door of one Prince Buthelezi and the leadership of the ANC. So you can see that there is a sanitization of this issue. Leanne, let me be categoric. Yesterday, we had the leadership of the ANC visiting the Buthelezi family. And there is an acknowledgement that there is a need to continue the reconciliation agenda between the two parties on the basis that 20,000 people died in the low-intensity black-on-black civil war. Of those 20,000, 12,000 of them were members of the IFP and leaders of the IFP. I then want to say that anybody who wants to engage in this discussion must get a copy of Dr. Anthea Jeffrey's People's War, where she spells out the extent to which and how this black-on-black civil war played out. It would be wholly unfair for people to blame Prince Buthelezi and never once having charged him or taken him to court. Because in 1999, President Mbeki and Prince Buthelezi unveiled a memorial in Thokoza of victims' names from the IFP and the ANC as an acknowledgement of the fact that the two parties had been engaged in that kind of violence. So do we now say, Leanne, that the inverse of the narrative then should be, if Prince Buthelezi, who had never once ordered a hit or gave an instruction for violence to be meted out, do we then blame Mr. Tambo as an individual? Because that's why I'm saying the narrative is dangerous. On one hand, it says it isolates Prince Buthelezi and then says the leadership of the ANC. Who's that leadership? So I think that there has to be a prevailing of some sobriety on a difficult question of violence because we lost lives. And it's precisely why Prince Buthelezi was at pains about the reconciliation agenda, which he believed that the two parties owed it to history and the future to set the record straight. Of course, the man who wins the war writes the book, and that's what happened in 1994. But at the same time, I'm fundamentally convinced that Prince Buthelezi dedicated his life to the cause of freedom. It's precisely why in 2010, Mr. Zuma in the Sona address thanked Prince Buthelezi for his role in the release of Nelson Mandela. It is precisely why Mr. Mandela thanked him. Mamuwin Matikizela Mandela called Prince Buthelezi a freedom fighter in his own right. And I do think the SABC itself, respectfully, as we have seen coverage over the past few days, the limited focus to the violence question on a life of 95 years is in itself not doing justice.
Yeah, I suppose if I may come in defense, and I think that is, it is an issue that is always and was always going to be spoken about. It doesn't take away from an entire life of 95 years, and certainly one that we've been covering in, and I imagine the most balanced way possible in terms of getting words from parliamentarians that have had nothing but good to say about him. But as you mentioned right at the beginning of the interview, there are going to be differing views, and there are going to be, once somebody passes on and has such a long life and a life that contributed a lot to the country that we live in at the moment, there are going to be views. There certainly are. And I think this is a platform to hear very differing views. And that's why the moment we received a message from you to come through and respond, we were very fast to put you on air. So, that is the kind of voice that we want to give. I want to get back a little bit to the article that was written by Mondli. This is not the first time he's been scathing of the leadership of the Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. I mean, when you read his articles, you sort of, it does, he's been personal against you and a lot of the other members that are a part of the IFP, and spoke about this last year already, is basically saying Buthelezi has lived, I'm quoting from one of his articles, Buthelezi has lived a long life and is now headed for the home stretch of his race. Because of this, he and those around him are obviously concerned about the portrayal of his legacy and want history to be kind to the most high-profile and most enthusiastic black apartheid collaborator. To quote, that is what he said. Just to tell you, we've also reached out to Mondli a few times. He says he's out of the country and can't speak right now, so we are wanting to hear from him. But, I mean, talk to us more about this. This has been a long time coming.
No. Mondli, as I'm saying, he must tell us the context of his participation in an article that's not disputed, written by him, where he confesses as Oscar Gumede. That's why we marched and we presented chapter and verse evidence to his to the city press and the shareholders. They've not responded a year later to the issues that we placed on the table because they know for a fact that we are right. Mondli Makhanya has got a biased reading of history and no acknowledgement of the atrocities of that violence, where 20,000 people died and 12,000 of them are IFP people. Because the question is, who killed those IFP people? At whose instruction? Mondli must present evidence of Prince Buthelezi ordering these hits, ordering this violence. He can't just make a categoric statement and say Prince was a killer. Where's the evidence to back it up? Because you see, the danger with untested allegations is that they become a truth. And we have been calling on Mr. Makhanya years on end now to present that evidence. He's never done so.
Yeah.
So he does not masquerade as an authority. Other than that, he is an active participant of the violence that killed our people.
And that's certainly something that I do hope we get answers from, because it's, as I mentioned, it's not the first time he's written something like this. In fact, it was probably people automatically, once they'd heard, were saying, "Ooh, I wonder what angle and what kind of obituary he would be writing." But I don't want to dwell on that, because that's, you know, then we're feeding into it, and that is not the point of this interview. The point is to actually take a different side and to hear from you, your personal interactions with the Prince Buthelezi, what it was like having somebody like that around. I mean, when we did speak to a lot of the parliamentarians and they were giving their sort of views on him, they would say it was like really having an adult in the house. He was the guy that would sort of rein things in and say, "Come on, what are you doing here?" What was it like for you to work with a man that has, you know, really been a very integral part of South Africa for decades?
I consider it to be the greatest privilege and honor of my life to have been mentored by a master. And I can summarize Prince Buthelezi's life by saying he is a man who loved his country and dedicated his life to this country until the very end. He was a patriot, he was a freedom fighter, he was a voice of reason. And most importantly, he was somebody who was committed to servant leadership. If we look at the developmental agenda that he spearheaded, you can see the extent to which he was concerned about the socio-economic development of our people under the most difficult of circumstances. Because even in the previous interview, I think there's a miscategorization about Bantustans and so on. This country had 4 Bantustans. It was the TBVC state. Because Prince Buthelezi refused the balkanization of this country. And we are one South Africa, and that's why KwaZulu was never an independent state. So these are also the discussions we need to have. It's precisely why people from KwaZulu had South African passports, and there was all sorts of other anglings in the TBVC states. The second point is around the issue that Prof. Vilakazi refers to insofar as Eugene de Kock is concerned. There was an ongoing agenda which was called Make the Country Ungovernable and Liberation Now and Education Later, which sought to destroy property, including government property and institutions, which was at the time schools and so on, which KwaZulu education continued here. The resuscitation of the University of Zululand, amongst others, which was called the Bush College, the creation of the Mangosuthu University of Technology in Umlazi, and the building of schools and the building of and construction of teacher training colleges, and so on and so forth. Yesterday, Dr. Zweli Mkhize was acknowledging the quality of education and infrastructure which he received at Kwadlangezo. Now, the program to make the country ungovernable dictated that those institutions must be protected. So it is a miscategorization then to say that the IFP was being armed for these things. I do want to say, Leanne, we acknowledge the fact that we are in a difficult moment of national reflection for every South African.
Indeed.
But what we are calling for is for fairness and a contextualization of each individual's reflection into the circumstances of the time. And again, I challenge anyone to present chapter and verse evidence which says Prince Buthelezi ever once ordered or gave an instruction. And I tell you now, they will not produce it. and therefore it's an unfair categorization on the men.
I'm glad that we had you on. Thank you for joining us this morning and having your right to reply. In 30 seconds, may I ask you, do we know the time of the funeral as yet? Do we have any further details? We know it's on Friday, but if you can just update us, is there anything else we know as yet?
Then I will be briefing the media sometime today, and your team of SABC is on the ground, so we'll give full details once I've concluded all the necessary consultations. But the dates given of Wednesday and Friday stand. Thank you very much.
We'll definitely be there. Thank you very, very much. IFP spokesperson Mkhuleko Hlengwa talking to us.